Good afternoon to you all. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Peter Fiekowsky. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning.
Peter Fiekowsky is the author of the book Climate Restoration, which was recently published in German under the title Wiederherstellung des Klimas. We only have 25 minutes, so I'm going to get right into it. Peter, people who have been working on climate change for years increasingly feel that we are running out of time. How do you see it?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. If we don't do anything, we're running out of time. And if we choose to do something, then we can do it in time, definitely.
So you're optimistic?
Yeah. More and more people are realizing that the thought that it's hopeless, that we can't affect it, is not a valid thought. That nature has removed the CO2 that we need to remove from the atmosphere many, many times. And the only reason that we're not doing it is that in 1990, when the United Nations created the UN framework for climate change, they at the time they decided that our goal was to eliminate human intervention in the climate, right? So stop making it worse. Well, it's now 35 years later, and now the atmosphere is, as predicted, terrible for the climate, and we need to intervene to make it better and change the UN language. And that's the only barrier to restoring it, is changing the UN language. And the book is pointing out that we have the techniques that we need, we have the finance that we need.
You founded the Foundation for Climate Restoration. So we are not just writing about what needs to be done. We are doing something about it. What is the foundation's goal?
Their mission is to have climate restoration be an idea whose time has come. So primarily to promote legislation and articles discussing restoring the climate.
One result of the foundation's work is that the US Senate passed a resolution making climate restoration, pretty much as you described it in your book, a top policy priority. Now the government would have to start making concrete steps, but that's not a small thing, is it?
Well, yes and no. It was not the US Senate, it was the California Senate that passed the resolution in July saying that California is committed to restoring the climate for future generations. And we're working hard to find a member of Congress to introduce it into the US Congress and Senate. And I think that will happen in the next 2 months. What's interesting is, since we wrote the book, we realized, and actually we've done more analytic calculations of how can we restore the climate, especially based on the National Academies of Science report from a year and a half ago. And they confirmed that using iron fertilization in the ocean is really quite inexpensive. This is what the data I've seen showed, and they've actually given the peer-reviewed evidence for it. And so the cost of duplicating how nature removes massive amounts of CO2 before ice ages, the cost of that is far less than $1 billion a year, perhaps as little as $100 million a year. And so it doesn't require action from the US government or the EU. It just requires their permitting it, because at the moment, the private funders who would be delighted to save their grandchildren feel that they cannot go in opposition to the UN language. The UN intention was to keep our planet healthy, but the language they chose in 1990 has been overcome by events.
So it sounds to me that you have a plan in mind, and this book is probably a part of this plan. So you mentioned already some of the points on the list, but again, what is your plan?
What's the plan? The plan, well, it's maturing as the months go by. So at the moment, our plan is to get discussion from the U.S. Department of Energy within the next 2 months, and about restoring the climate. And uh, uh, optimistically, we're hoping that President Biden, and perhaps you can induce some German leadership to discuss the concept that we actually do have an obligation to find a way to restore the climate for our children. It's an obvious statement, but it's so obvious it's difficult for a leader to say it. So then once it's discussed, hopefully at the UN climate conference in Dubai in December, uh, that just the discussion will be enough to release the funding needed from private foundations, and then the action can happen. So really, there are two critical physical things that need to happen. One is to advance the nature's climate restoration, which is the accelerating photosynthesis, and it's photosynthesis in the ocean. That's how nature produces ice ages, because photosynthesis on land is wonderful. Of course, we want to plant forests, we want to improve our agriculture, but we all know that plants and trees die after a few decades, and eventually that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. In the ocean, it's very different. When plants and the animals that eat them die, they sink into the deep ocean, where there's no oxygen for it to rot, and so that carbon stays sequestered for typically 100,000 years, and that gives us plenty of time to find other longer term solutions. 100,000 years, I think, is a good length of time, because we just need about 50 years of freedom, of getting back to find the better ways to get the job done. And so there's the ocean fertilization, which duplicates the dust storms, such as the ones that blow off the Sahara Desert, across the Atlantic, and into the Caribbean. Um, uh, the dust that blows is pink, and what makes it pink is iron, and it's that iron which is the missing micronutrient, which allows a lot of photosynthesis to happen. And so the CO2 removal is one project, and that that can be done quite rapidly. And the other one is methane oxidation. That is, uh, we're getting increasing methane out of the permafrost, the melting permafrost in the Arctic, especially the permafrost under the continental shelf north of Siberia. There's huge amounts of grass that's been buried century after century after century, and millennium after millennium. And the last time our planet had the Arctic ice cap melt, like at this point, we're about 80, the Arctic ice, the ice on the Arctic Ocean is about 85% gone. The last time that happened, there was a massive burst of methane from the undersea permafrost, and that extincted about a third of the species on our planet. That would be a terrible thing. And so the methane oxidation can remove that methane, can oxidize it before it causes a climate disaster and an ecological disaster. So those are the two projects. And amazingly, using the methods that nature uses, as I said, is the iron fertilization for CO2. And with the methane, people who know about methane know that it only lasts in the atmosphere for 10 years or so. So if we double the natural rate of eliminating methane, then that'll give us the tools we need to protect against the methane burst, and also reduce the impacts of, it'll cool the planet by a little bit, and make our current heat waves and floods and droughts and wild storms. It'll reduce that. So that's the plan is, as I said, is to get attention in the US. And again, hopefully, I'm very glad that you've published our book in German to get the discussion going for restoration, which then gives the permission for investors and foundations to fund it, and then perform the two key projects, and as well as fund the governance. So that's the whole scheme. It sounds almost too simple, but most major solutions end up being simple after you figured them out.
One of the things I love about your book is that you think like a member of the global human family. You talked about the politicians already, and we need them for such a project. But looking at the governments around the world, one gets the impression that they are thinking only of their own interests and the short-term interests of their countries. Can we stop global warming with this limited selfish thinking?
No. Well, yes, we can, not with it, but we don't need to change it. And of course, it will change eventually. Like most things, it'll change when we least expect it. Forcing change doesn't usually work well. However, excuse me, the interest, I find that it's very important to look at these projects sort of like a business. And in a business, when you're selling your product, you want to figure out who is your customer and which of those customers have the funding to get the job done. And the customer for climate restoration are our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And whereas the customers for the government is businesses and voters, and at least in the US, I'm sure it's true in Europe, lobbyists. And our grandchildren don't qualify as clients of the government. And so I think it's foolish to expect our government to defend our great-grandchildren, because that's not what the government is here for. Now, in the future, that may happen, and I think it will. In First Nation cultures, they have the 7-generation principle to make sure that common decisions take into account 7 generations, but that's not true yet in our Western governments. And I think it's important to accept the world the way it is, accept the structures the way they are, and then build a new structure. So we've organized the Grandparents Fund for restoring the climate. It's GCR.fund. And it's a way for grandparents like you and me to commit $10 a month or 10 euros a month or 100 to fund these projects. And once we get to 10 or 30,000 grandparents like yourself and me, I don't know if you're a grandparent or not, but you look like you could be. When we get to several tens of thousands, then the billionaire community, Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg, they're also grandparents, and they'll certainly join in. And that can be done in parallel with the government work to take care of current companies, right? Because when we restore the climate, that's going to change economics somewhat, because there's a lot of work in the EU, for example. There's a whole economy around carbon trading. And when we restore the climate, that carbon trading will disappear. And there's billions of dollars that the government's going to need to figure out how to keep those industries happy. because if they don't, then of course those industries will block the climate restoration. So there's work for the governments to do, but it's separate work than what we grandparents need to fund.
You seem to see solutions and developments that the others do not. That is what makes your optimism so convincing. It seems that we as a mankind have everything in our hands for a better life. It's only in our heads that we still have to rearrange things a bit. Why do you see things so differently from most other people?
Well, I've been fortunate throughout my career and life to have been exposed to very exciting projects. When I was 6 years old, President Kennedy initiated the moonshot, and he said, we're gonna land a man on the moon and bring him back safely in 8 years, 8.5 years. Well, he said by the end of the decade, which sounded easier. And interestingly, the scientific community was fully against it because they said this is too chancy, too risky. We should use our resources for incremental progress, step by step by step. And throughout the 60s, the scientific community opposed it. But of course, it was a fantastic accomplishment. We created computers and microchips and just hundreds of technologies that have taken off and transformed the world. And so then as I got older, I was, in addition to my physics work, my work here in Silicon Valley, working with microchip manufacturing, I sort of matured from doing astronomy, and I decided I wanted a bigger audience. I went to silicon manufacturing. And but I also did volunteer work for hunger and poverty issues. And the organization I volunteered for, it's called results.org, and they're still very effective. They were asked by UNICEF to raise the money from Congress to finish vaccinating all of the world's children. And at the time, this was the Reagan administration. So the US was looking inwards and was not inclined to use our resources in the rest of the world. But we spoke with Congress, and we got the funding, and vaccination went from 8%, just US or the North America and Europe, to 85% of all the children on the world now receive vaccinations. That happened as they planned by 1990. They made a promise in 1977, an audacious promise to vaccinate all the world's children. Now, they only got to 85%, but it transformed what it meant to be a parent across the world. And then we worked on microfinance and had an 10-year project to get half the world's population living on less than $1 a day involved in microfinance. And we did it, but it took 11.5 years. But again, it transformed on the world, the poverty. And because there's a structure now where people can pull themselves out of poverty. And then finally, we did this similar thing with funding AIDS treatment and turned around the AIDS epidemic. And I was a minor actor in that. I was helping coach our groups in California, but I was spoiled by the fact that if you make an audacious project that's important to people, just like going to the moon was important for us, just like vaccinating children was important to us, then the resources come and the shortcuts come, and it happens. And it never happens the way you think it will. I was more involved in the microfinance work, and you think that it's all about banking and funds transfers and guarantees. The hard work in microfinance turned out to be finding the poor, because when you're part of being poor is being embarrassed about being poor, and you can't find them. And so most of the work back then in around 2000 was building the structures to find the poor so they could be helped, could be included. Similarly, with the climate, we thought that it was about the technology for energy and governance, but no, it's actually The critical thing is dealing with the resignation. When I talk to my children's friends, the resignation about the future is very deep because people read the news and it looks like the future is very bad. And that leads to the thinking and the actions consistent with a very bad future. And, and so I was trained by the universe, so to speak, and a wonderful course called the Landmark Forum to actually acknowledge the predictable, almost certain future. But once you realize that that's what's predictable, then you can ask, well, what else is possible? What would I want? If a miracle happened, what would the outcome be? If wonderful spirits came and just created a miracle, and that's how climate restoration happened. Is I got very depressed because I could see that the arc of destruction that the UN has painted was coming true. It was totally coming true. And I spoke with a former Secretary of Energy in the US, a physics Nobel laureate, and he said, no, we can't restore the climate. There's not enough money. And the resignation was just tangible. And then actually after I spoke with that Nobel laureate, I spoke with one of the top economists, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia, and he works very closely with the United Nations. And I asked him the same question: should we make the goal of restoring the climate because we want that for our children? And he thought for a millionth of a second. He said, no, because it's physically impossible. And I realized that the resignation is just deep in our collective soul, because the physicist blamed the economist and the economist blamed the physicist. They both felt helpless, ineffective. And this is, the former Secretary of Energy of the United States and the top economist at the United Nations, more or less, feeling helpless and ineffective. And so I think the transformation here is to have people acknowledge, yes, things are going in a bad direction, and we could go in a different direction, and we all want to. And that's what the book is talking about.
It is certainly not easy to fight against people's deep-rooted thinking and established solutions of the economy and politics. And what motivates you on your way?
Well, what motivates me is I did a course 25 years ago, and at the end of the course, they said, okay, create a mission statement for yourself. And I did this 3 times. And the one I ended up with from 20 some years ago is on my wall still. It's a little bit yellow. And it says that, I'm looking up at it, my mission in life is to leave a world that we're proud of to our children. And so, when I get distracted, I look up and I remember why I'm here, which is to leave a world that we're proud of. And I'm 68 now. And so I've got a few more decades, but I have nothing better to do than that. And it's very exciting. I'm looking at your face and seeing the huge smile. There's nothing better in life than giving people a new lease on life. And inside of that, we start taking the appropriate actions, because what I'm discovering is we don't need to convince people to think differently. All we need to do is notice the resignation, like, oh my God, I really am resigned that it's hopeless. And more people are not having children and so on, which is actually good for the planet, but there's a resignation involved. But once you notice the resignation and let it be for a while, hopefully only a few hours, but for many people it's for a few years, then you accept that the arc is going this way. Okay, now I have nothing to lose. Let's change it. Let's act like we're going to restore the climate. And over the last 10 years, I'm now really 100% confident we're going to do it. Even with all the wars that are breaking out, I see no sign that people aren't going to move that direction. In fact, one of my colleagues was working with the African Union last year to get the iron fertilization operating around Africa. Because one of the nice things is when you have photosynthesis in the ocean, just like on land, when you have photosynthesis, you have food. You have trees that make nuts and fruits and so on. In the ocean, the algae that grows is food for the fish. And when you feed the fish, they grow better, and you have more food for the fishermen on the coasts. So the African Union is now pushing to get the ocean fertilization going just for the fish. But of course, if it restores the climate, that's good. But again, as a government, they're accountable to their adults who need to feed their children. And they're happy to also help the climate. So it's moving. The things are really moving, is my point.
While wrapping up, if anyone from Germany would like to get involved in the work of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, do we have some space for some folks from Germany?
Oh, that would be most wonderful. Yes, they can go to the website foundationforclimaterestoration.org and sign up, and then someone there will connect with you. It'd be wonderful to get one or two groups or 3 groups started in Germany, and do what we're doing in the US, which is talking to leaders, just to ask them to talk publicly about restoring the climate. And perhaps even have I don't know if you do resolutions in Germany like we do in the US Congress. A resolution in Congress, it's sort of like a law, but it's just it's a statement. And so it doesn't have any money involved, but it puts a what do they call it, a stick in the sand.
Peter, thank you so much. I spoke with Peter Fiekowsky, author of the book Wiederherstellung des Klimas at the Frankfurter Buchmesse. And the restoration of the climate is something I wish for all of us. My name is Andreas Stenowski, and I'm a publisher at Continental Verlag. See you. All the best.